This is Stadia.
To support resolutions up to 4K at 60 frames per second.
Finally get to share Google's vision for the future of games.
Google has decided to begin winding down its video game streaming service, Stadia.
Google Stadia is dying and handing out refunds at its funeral.
Google Stadia was supposed to be the cloud gaming service that revolutionized how we accessed our favorite games. But what made Stadia different to its competitors in the cloud gaming market, like PlayStation Now, GeForce Now, and Microsoft's Xbox Cloud? The major selling point was the ability to play AAA games without a console. All you needed was Google Chrome or a Chromium-based browser to stream games on a PC or a laptop. Now in 2019, Chrome dominated the web browser market with over 70% of users around the world using Chrome. There were also 2.5 billion gamers, and with a large majority of them using Chrome, it made the initial outreach huge. Before I go any further, Stadia was intended for casual gamers and those that didn't want to sink money into a console or hardware. If you had an RTX 2080 Super, a 5700 XT, or a PS4 or an Xbox, you weren't the target audience. Okay? Now let's continue. Google weren't playing around, no pun intended, when they mentioned AAA games could be streamed using the service. Destiny 2, Red Dead Redemption 2 and Assassin's Creed Odyssey were all launch titles on Stadia. But how was this even possible? Let me explain. Players could stream games by utilising Google's data centres across the world. This meant the infrastructure to deliver the service was already in place, but that's not all. Google had around 20 data centres around the world at the time, which meant no user was ever too far from one, which would effectively lower the latency. But Google had one more ace up their sleeve. Google are one of the top 3 hyperscale providers when it comes to data center efficacy. They have a great outreach, AI-focused infrastructure, as well as being energy efficient to name a few. But to cut a long story short, they're basically the best in class, which was incredibly beneficial for Stadia. Stadia was also integrated with YouTube. Play buttons could appear on trailers as well as gameplay videos, which would launch the game directly on Stadia without leaving YouTube. There was crowdplay, which allowed players to join a streamer's session, state shares which let players jump into a certain part of a game, as well as being able to record gameplay directly onto the platform. Stadia also offered cross-platform saves on certain games. Earlier I mentioned that all you needed was Chrome in order to play, but what I didn't mention was that Stadia could also be launched on a Chromecast, Nvidia Shield, tablets as well as phones. I mean, who needs one of those fancy consoles or mega PCs when you could just buy a Chromecast Ultra for $70? Clearly Google had a dream for Stadia to dominate the market, and all these features sounded pretty good. So what could go wrong? Stadia would go on to launch in November 2019 to worldwide disappointment. The first issue was the game lineup. They had no exclusives. Now console manufacturers make exclusive games to drive hardware sales, because that's the only way gamers can experience the game. Stadia launched with 22 games that were mostly older ports. Yes, I know that Guilt was a timed exclusive, but let's face reality. No one was waiting up all night to play Guilt on Stadia. All the key features that Google had hyped up prior to release were missing. These included state share, crowd play, family sharing achievements, streaming to YouTube and the Buddy Pass. And remember when I mentioned just buying a Chromecast Ultra instead of picking up an expensive console? Well, you were shit out of luck if you did. You see, existing Ultras couldn't run Stadia, only the new bundled versions could, so everyone else with a Chromecast had to wait several weeks for a firmware update. Google claimed games would run at 4K 60 on Stadia.
When Stadia launches, we will have increased performance significantly to support resolutions up to 4K at 60 frames per second.
4K at 60 frames per second. 4K at 60 frames per second.
I am invincible!
Yeah, they didn't run at 4K 60. Most games were rendered at 1080 or 1440p and then upscaled to 4K, but that isn't how the service was marketed. Google made it sound as though the games would be rendered natively at 4K. This resulted in artifacts appearing on players' screens due to the upscaled image. Google then pushed the blame onto the devs. They claimed that while Stadia was technically capable of 4K 60, that it was down to the devs to implement it and that upscaling would suffice for the time being. These devs were clearly the problem. I mean, how hard is it to make AAA games run at 4K 60 on a web browser? Then there was the subscription model, which was a bigger scam than Netflix with ads. or any streaming service with ads. There was Stadia Pro, which was a paid subscription. This would set you back $10 a month and you'd have access to the entire Stadia library. The key word here is access. You'd still have to buy each game for full price, which begs the question, why do we have to pay for a sub in the first place? Well, a subscription would allow you to play games up to 4K resolution and with 5:1 sound. But hold on a second, the service was originally advertised with games running at 4K 60.
To support resolutions up to 4K at 60 frames per second.
Now you have to pay for the 4K resolution, which was actually 1080p being upscaled. And don't think we didn't spot that 5:1 surround sound was also being hidden behind a paywall, like the pay-to-win audio settings in Call of Duty that I may or may not have paid for. There was also the fact that the game you paid for lived on Google's servers. So, if for whatever reason the service was to shut down, you'd never be able to play that game again. Despite Google having all those data centers around the world, you'd basically need to live in one to maintain a good connection. The most common issue was input lag, and if you aren't aware, this is basically a delayed response in a game despite you pressing a button. This made games like Mortal Kombat 11 and Destiny 2 an absolute chore to play unless you did have a good connection. A game's resolution and frame rate would also drop to compensate for a bad connection, which would make the games look blurry or pixelated. You could also be disconnected from the service whilst playing, as well as audio desynchronizing with the visuals. Google had clearly made some mistakes. Some big mistakes. But what were the biggest? Stadia launched with a small library of games, 22 to be specific. Now 96% of the titles were older games that were already available on console or PC. And to add some perspective, PlayStation now had over 750 games available, while Game Pass had over 100 and GeForce now had over 500. The lack of Stadia exclusives meant there was nothing compelling enough to drive gamers to the service. Google realised they'd need some exclusive games on Stadia, so they created their own internal game studio in Stadia Games and Entertainment. The plan to develop first-party games would come to a halt when Google closed the studio down 2 years later. What made this even more noteworthy was the fact the studio failed to develop any games. But to be fair, AAA games usually take 3 to 5 years to develop. I doubt the devs were sitting there for 2 years spinning their wheels. The second mistake was the marketing, which caused widespread confusion. The public didn't know whether Stadia required a console or not, with the whole point of Stadia being that you don't need a console, so this wasn't a question that you want the public to be asking. But due to how Stadia was marketed at launch, you can understand why people were confused. When Google launched Stadia, they revealed the Founders Edition and the Premier Edition. Now I don't know about you guys, but these sound like console bundles or a special edition graphics card. In other words, they sound like hardware. These bundles included a Stadia controller as well as a Chromecast Ultra to play games on a TV. This made it seem like you needed to purchase hardware to use Stadia, which completely undermined the whole no console required marketing. Then there was the way they marketed the subscription. When Stadia launched, you had to pay for a sub to use the service. The free tier hadn't yet released, which led to the public thinking you had to pay for a subscription. Media outlets had dubbed Stadia as the Netflix for games, and this couldn't have been any further from the truth. You can access every show on Netflix for a monthly fee. With Stadia, you had to pay for a subscription and then pay for each game individually. Now my third point isn't really a mistake, but more of an observation. People didn't have trust in Google and were extremely skeptical with Stadia. A reason for this is that over the years, Google had cancelled over 200 products and services. Google wants all of their products to reach millions of users and of course generate revenue. If any of their projects don't gain traction, and we're talking immediate traction here, they'll just cancel it. On a side note, there's a website that tracks all of Google's cancelled projects. Member Jamboard? Member Google Hangouts? Member YouTube Originals? Send your donut, members. Now I could list further mistakes or go into more detail, but I'm sure I've painted the picture. At this point, Stadia was hanging on for dear life, but it couldn't withhold the strain any longer. Next, we'll look at the events that caused the collapse of Stadia. I previously mentioned that Stadia closed their first-party studios in 2021, but I'll give you some further context. Phil Harrison, the VP of Stadia, stated they wanted the service to be more accessible for third-party developers. He believed this would give Stadia the best chance of long-term success. The shutdown of Stadia games resulted in over 150 employees losing their jobs, but why did Google suddenly change their mind on first-party development? Some speculated it was due to the poor sales of Cyberpunk 2077, 2027, whilst others believed it was due to the acquisition of ZeniMax Media by Microsoft. Here's a fun fact for you. The Quarry by Supermassive Games and High on Life by Squanch Games were originally being developed for Stadia, but this shutdown resulted in the projects being picked up by other publishers. To add insult to injury, Stadia Games employees were told they'd lost their jobs an hour before it was made public. They were also informed via email, which whilst bad, is better than getting fired in a group Zoom call. Employees that didn't receive the email or weren't working that day found out on Twitter or other social media outlets. Not even publishers or third-party devs working with Stadia knew about the closure, with devs still working on projects until the public announcement. Stadia also had low player numbers. Whilst official numbers were never released, it was estimated the service had a peak of around 1 to 3 million players over its lifetime. PlayStation Now had over 1 million subs at the time, Game Pass had over 10 million, and GeForce had over 1 million users. Stadia was getting destroyed by the competition and hadn't gained the traction Google were hoping for. I've already mentioned that The Quarry and High on Life were picked up by other publishers, but they weren't the only ones that bailed on Stadia. Hideo Kojima was developing a horror game exclusively for Stadia, which was cancelled. Google didn't agree any new deals with Take-Two Interactive or Ubisoft to secure more ports, and Harmonix, the devs of Rock Band, had a Stadia exclusive project cancelled after Google ruled out third-party exclusives. So at this point, Google had closed their own internal studio, publishers were walking away from Stadia, and they had low player numbers. Could Stadia turn it all around and become a success? Well, you've seen the title of the video. September 29th, 2022 would see an announcement that the whole world was expecting. Google was shutting down Stadia due to it not gaining traction with users. That was a pleasant way of saying it was a flop, with the service being shut down entirely in January 2023. Despite Stadia failing, Google showed they had some integrity left. Any games or hardware purchased on the Stadia store were refunded, but the hardware didn't need to be returned. This meant you got to keep the controller and the Chromecast Ultra as a token gift. Now let's be honest, Chromecast was on its way out and the controllers were made for Stadia. They probably lose more money by taking them all back and then having to dispose of them. Google didn't leave the cloud gaming space altogether though, as a month after the Stadia announcement, they revealed their new Chromebooks. They'd partnered with Nvidia, Microsoft and Amazon to have their respective cloud gaming services be supported on the Chromebooks. So what happened in the aftermath following the closure of Stadia? Well, remember I mentioned that Google let players keep their controllers. Google released a firmware update tool that converted Stadia's proprietary software into a standard Bluetooth controller. This meant you could ball out on Steam, emulators or your phones with a now exclusive piece of hardware. I wouldn't be surprised if this one day becomes the go-to controller for a random game in the speedrun community. There was also the issue of losing your game saves. Some games allowed for cross-platform progression with other consoles and PC, like Destiny 2, the Ubisoft titles and Red Dead 2. For other games you'd have to download a raw save file using Google Takeout and then transfer it to a saved data folder in your PC. If you didn't do this before the shutdown in January, then GG's, your game had gone to a better place, just like Stadia. The cloud gaming space would continue to thrive with the likes of GeForce Now, Xbox Cloud Gaming and PlayStation Now. In 2020 there were over 62 million cloud-based gamers, with the market being valued up to $1 billion. Just to give you an idea of how big the market is now, there's over 455 million cloud gamers in 2026 with a valuation of $19 billion. This goes to show that Google were in the right market for growth, but unable to make it due to a confusing business model, poor game library, and intense competition. And everything else that I mentioned in the video. Stadia wasn't the first cloud service to be axed, and it won't be the last.